before I get started, just to comment on Linda's introduction, when I mentioned I worked on the lake and I drove the police boat during my, and I mean, we're going back a few years now again, but I also was on the weed harvesting crew. And my one story there, a relative of mine is in the audience too, and he worked with me as well. But my father was a pilot, and he had a small plane. And we would fly over the lake. And if you've ever had the chance to fly over the lake, the color of all the lakes around here are not blue like the Caribbean. They're green, almost like a split pea soup, green. So, but that's just the natural color of the lake. And you can actually, the clarity of the lake is such that you can see into the water. So as we would look down and see the areas where we would be cutting weeds underwater, it was pretty clear. And I'm going to give you, for instance, what it would compare to. If you took your lawn and took about 3 or 4 passes through the lawn with a lawnmower, that's what it looked like. So it just, as hard as we tried to do the right thing, and I know you're still doing the right thing now, the success of cutting weeds is pretty limited. And the other interesting thing is, a lot of people don't know this, on a sunny day, weeds, submerging weeds in the lake, will grow an inch in a day. So it's pretty hard to stay ahead of that, when you got that kind of growth. But anyway, I just wanted to add that because I did spend a large part of my life on Cedar Lake. And where this all leads is to our story this evening. And the key is, it is a story. It's not just a presentation. This is my great-great-grandfather, Lehman Rosenheimer. And the most intimidating thing to me of this presentation is he's right over my shoulder. And if anyone sees his eyes move, I've said something wrong, so please cue me in if you see that happening. But this truly is a great story of a young man from Bavaria. And for those of you, you've heard of Bavaria, but Bavaria is currently in southern Germany. So he grew up in Bavaria, and he had a quest for a better life in a new country. And I'm just quickly summarizing here. So he took the journey across the Atlantic, arrived in New York, as most of the immigrants did, and he soon settled in Wisconsin to begin his new life. He got married, raised a large family, had great business success, and he and his sons settled several local villages, and we're getting all the details of that. He was born on June 12th of 1820 in Dormans, Bavaria. So last year, we recognized the 200th anniversary of his birth. It's hard to imagine 200 years have gone by here, but they have. At age 20, he left his family and sailed to New York. Age 20. So are we talking about a rebellious teenager? Possibly, but we don't know that. But there are other reasons that we'll touch on. He had $200 with him. That was all the money he had. So leaves his family, sails to a new land with $200, and a big disadvantage, he only knew German. He didn't know English. So you put that all in context as we travel with him through his life. Later on, his business successes dubbed him the title of the Merchant Prince of Washington County. And his influence impacted the development and settlement of what we know as Slinger today, which was Schlesingerville at that time, the village of Kewaskum, and ultimately on Big Cedar Lake. So that just kind of puts things in context right now. So a little bit of Lehman's family history. His great-grandfather and grandfather were rabbis in the Kingdom of Bavaria. His father, Moses Jomtau Cohn Rosenheimer, was a cattle merchant. I'm going to repeat that. He was a cattle merchant. And that's important because as you hear about the businesses that he started, it had to do with cattle. Okay? So we'll come back to that. He was the youngest of 7 children, and his oldest sibling was 18 years older than he was. So again, being the youngest, and at that time, it if you were the youngest in a family, you weren't likely to inherit much of anything from your family. And that's just the way life was. So, when you put all these things together, why would a 20-year-old leave his family, go to a new land, take a risk of sailing across the ocean? So you got to think of some of these things. Why would he do that? One second. I was going to say, at the time in Bavaria, this again is the mid-1800s. So remember, he was born in 1820, so we're talking 1840 now. That there was a lot of political and social unrest in Europe. There were crop failures, the potato blight, industrialization was happening. So a lot of upheaval overall. So these factors led to the mass immigration from Europe into the U.S. Again, we're talking in the 1840s. So he arrived in New York City at Ellis Island as all the immigrants came through in 1840 after his transatlantic crossing. So let's put things in perspective. How long did it take to get across the Atlantic? 6 to 12 weeks on a sailboat. Now, I just was in Europe a few weeks ago, and my 6 to 7 hour transatlantic flight seemed like a long time. And can you imagine a month and a half to 3 months to journey? So you're certainly at the mercy of the winds, at the waves, and there was, disease on these ships. So a lot of risks that you took in that era, and, thousands and thousands of people took that challenge. So when he arrived in New York, he worked for a short time on a farm in New York, milking cows. And it was learned that he milked up to 18 cows a day. Now, we're not talking about milking parlors and automatic milking. This is milking by hand, so obviously it was hard work. And he knew this wasn't why he came over to the New World, but he probably had to make some money at the time. And, not knowing the language, I'm sure he had to learn that as all the immigrants did that didn't know much English. So he must have heard, as the others, that there was a further migration to the west. And to the west, in this case, meant Milwaukee. And the reason, and a lot of you probably have heard this, that a lot of Germans settled in this area is the topography reminded them of the area they left, of Germany. Good farmland, kind of rolling hills, not mountainous or anything. So that really was one of the reasons so many of them, came to this part of the country. And at that time, too, the white settlement was just beginning in Wisconsin because the Indians, really, Indian tribes controlled much of the land, and I'll get into that detail in just a moment. But just the journey from New York to Milwaukee, we keep thinking, well, New York to Wisconsin, that's not bad. A few hours in the car. No, it was 3 weeks. And it was by canal boat on the left and then the Great Lakes steamer on the right. So, we think in terms of modern transportation, planes and cars and buses and things, you didn't have that at that time. So water was your main method of travel from point to point. So after he arrived in Milwaukee, he met a man by the name of John Schlecht, and they became business partners. And Lehman's gears were always turning in his head. He's thinking, okay, if we just made this journey and have come into Milwaukee, there's a lot behind us. They need a place to stay. They need a place to eat and drink. So the two of them together started a hotel and tavern right at the port of Milwaukee. So right when a lot of these immigrants would step off the ship, they had a place for them to stop. So again, as I was thinking last evening, as I was helping Linda with some of my own personal bio, I'm thinking, okay, I'm college educated, I have a master's degree, and I still can't figure out everything that he did, because remember that you didn't have the colleges and universities, and here's a guy who's already figured out, hey, let's start a hotel. And you're going to hear many more of his business successes as the presentation continues. But, he really was a very intelligent man and had a business sense to him. So this tavern and hotel at the port provided lodging and food and beverages to these arriving immigrants. And ultimately, the location became the Chicago Northwestern train depot, which is pictured here. And it's located at the end of Wisconsin Avenue. So if you can picture today where the Betty Brinn Children's Museum is in Milwaukee, that's about the location. Now, there's been a lot of fill added, and that's why you can go, the end of Wisconsin Avenue isn't right on the lake. There's still a little bit of land between them, but that's because of the fill over the years. So here's another interesting part of the story. So Lehman was successful in this business with his partner, John Schlicht. And in 1843, he decided to return to Bavaria to see his family. And which is a very noble thing. Obviously, you left your family at 20, and you couldn't text them, you couldn't use Facebook to communicate with them. So there really wasn't a way of communicating. So he went back to see them and then decided to return back to the U.S., to his business. And here's where the story got interesting. He contracted typhoid fever upon his return, which was a deadly disease. And, obviously, had he not survived typhoid fever, we wouldn't have any more to talk about. But he did with the help of Barbara Herbst, who was one of his employees at the hotel. So she nursed him back to health, and they fell in love and got married the following year in 1844. 15 years old. Now, we're not talking scandal. At that time, 15 years was not illegal to get married, but, by today's standards, that's fairly young. And there's always a catch here. And the catch here is, so after he returned to health, what's interesting is Barbara's parents also immigrated from Bavaria shortly before. So they settled up in this area, in the Addison area. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So they were farmers in Addison. So Barbara, as she saw the life that they were living at the saloon, at the hotel, it was pretty rough. You had a lot of drinking, you had brawls, you had men coming off these ships, and she said, I've already saved your life once, I don't want to have to do it a second time, because, she feared for his welfare and his health. So she said, why don't we move out of Milwaukee to Addison to be maybe closer to mom and dad for her and to begin a new life. So again, we're going to see a journey of different moves in Lehman's life. So the first move was up to this area. This is important for those of you that aren't familiar with all the areas we're talking about. Russ, can I just come up here, or do you want to point them out? So here are the areas we're really focused on. Addison is just to the west of Allenton. Obviously, we know Big Cedar Lake, where we are, right over here. Slinger to the south, Kewaskum to the north. So those are the geographic areas we're focusing on, just so everyone knows. And the other thing, too, is, by car, these are all pretty short distances. But there weren't cars then. There was probably horse travel. And this is before even railroads at the time had come to the area. So the other thing, as I had mentioned, if you go back in history, the Menominee, the Potawatomi tribes had surrendered land claims to the federal government in 1831 and 1833, respectively. So again, they are the ones that had the land here. So as the white settlement came in, the Indian tribes retreated to reservations. And so the agreement was they were to leave the area by 1838. But they didn't all leave, so some Indian groups were still in the area. And Wisconsin became organized as a territory in 1836. And the next big step was statehood in 1848. So just to give you an idea of where things were in the 1830s and into the 1840s. So as we hear stories of people immigrating into this area, it was primarily in the 1840s and beyond, because the Indians were here in the 1830s until, I hate to use the term, we pushed them out, but we pushed them out. Not just in southeast Wisconsin, but really many areas of our country. So the next step is Lehman and Barbara decided they were going to farm, and surprise, surprise, they raised and butchered cattle. Remember I mentioned cattle before. So he obviously learned something from his father, that there was business in cattle. So he frequently traveled to purchase cattle and was away from home for days at a time. So Barbara, now think about it, you're living in the country and it's pretty wild, and there are Indians around, and she feared, because she didn't know, are the Indians friendly or are they not? And as it turned out, the Indians were very friendly, and all they really wanted was to barter for food and coffee. So as it turned out, she got along fine with the Indians and others, and obviously she wasn't too far from her parents either, because they were all in that same area. And the first 4 children they had were born while living in this farm. And obviously this isn't the farm, but an example of a farmhouse back in 1840. Next, another jump, Schlesingerville. For those of you that have not heard of Schlesingerville, it's present-day Slinger. And I will tell you a little bit where the Schlesingerville name came from. This is an important map as well. And many of the areas that you can see in green were properties that Lehman Rosenheimer owned. He had started to acquire land. The reason Lehman went to Schlesingerville, oh, thank you. Was upon learning of the railroad coming through, he knew that the railroad meant commerce. When because obviously you had what Slinger was a route between Milwaukee and Fond du Lac, a stage path or stagecoach run, and it essentially follows what is State Highway 175 today, if you can picture that. So, which I'm just going to point out here. This is 175. So many of Lehman's marks on Slinger are indicated here, and I'm just going to point a few out. His home was located here. The cemetery, which we're going to talk about, is here. And other businesses, an implement business, a brickyard, bank, etc., are all on the map. And I just want to give you an idea of what you're looking at as I describe some of these businesses that he started. So in addition to Lehman's success, his sons also learned from their father, and ultimately he set them up to take some of these businesses over. So it's not just creating a business and walking away. He was preparing his sons too to enjoy the same success that he had. So he had purchased 80 acres initially in Schlesingerville from a man by the name of Jesse Woods. And again, as I said, it's a stage route between Milwaukee and Fond du Lac. So he utilized this land for as many businesses. And his home is coming back. All right. So his home, which was built back in the 1850s, still stands today. It doesn't look like an old home. I mean, obviously it's been updated and modernized, but if you drive through Slinger on Highway 175, you would go past his home today. You can see it was a pretty good sized home because his family continued to grow as well. Okay, so a portion of the 80 acres he used to establish a private family cemetery. And this is the modern day cemetery. And you can see the gate. So if you've driven past this on Highway 175 heading out of Slinger, you would see this gate. The cemetery is actually up the hill. So you really can't tell it as a cemetery there. And when you see established in 1878, it was actually created earlier than that, in the 1850s. And the first two to be buried in the cemetery were his two sons, who died very young. So Lehman passed away in 1878, and that's where, when this gate was redone a few years back, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so, we decided, let's recognize 1878 as really the official start of the cemetery, because it was Lehman that had this concept. And when you think about it, of all the immigrants that came here, how many of them had the foresight to think family was so important to Lehman? And that's a theme that we're going to hear as we go on here. What better way to keep your family together in perpetuity than to have a cemetery? And I'm serious about that. It's not meant to be funny, but it's still, at the end of the presentation, we're going to get in a little more detail. But it's a special place for all the Rosenheimer relatives that are in the audience today, and they will all agree with you or with me about how important this place is, because this is where our ancestry is. Of all the people that hunt around on Ancestry.com and all these other sites to figure out where did I come from, who are my relatives, guess what? It's all right here for the Rosenheimers. And that means a lot, because a lot of people go to cemeteries to try to figure out heritage. We have it all right here. So, Lehman was a very smart man. Being a private family cemetery, you had to be a lineal descendant to be buried there, or a spouse of a lineal descendant, and that's still the case today. So not anyone can be buried there. You need to qualify by either, again, being a lineal descendant or a spouse. So Lehman began merchandising cattle, grains, hides, butter, eggs, and other farm products. The store, which he built, is circled here, became the center for farmers' trade in Schlesingerville. In 1867, his business success outgrew the original store, and this is actually the two-story building, not the original store, was built, which doubled the size of the original store. This building exists today as Tom's Bar and Grill. So that may be a familiar sight, but it is the same building. And if you look just to the far left, you can see that is his home that we saw just a picture ago. So everything was pretty tightly together. So Lehman continued to acquire significant land in Schlesingerville and began a farm implement business, which is modern day strap implement, a brewery, which became the Stork Brewery, a lumber yard, a brick yard, a bank, a grain elevator, and a post office. So this is, again, modern day, the intersection of Highway 144 and 175, and how it looked back in that era. You can see not a great deal of difference. It's incredible how some things really have stood the test of time. And one quick story about the bank, which I think you'll find interesting. So there was a competitive bank in the area that had a run on it. We all have heard about when banks have runs and they may need to close down. So what Lehman did, in knowing of this and fearing that that could happen to his bank, he entrusted a priest who was traveling on the train from Milwaukee to Slinger with a leather pouch. And in the pouch, he told the priest it contained peanuts. So the priest delivered the pouch to Lehman, and inside the pouch was $20,000 of paper cash. Moral of the story is, never lie to a priest, first of all. But anyway, it was his way of securing his bank during a potential run on the bank. So that was just kind of an interesting story that's been passed down. So the post office was also on the corner of 175 and 144 in 1906, and again, as it exists today. His son, John, was the postmaster from 1877 to 1915. So pretty good stretch there. And in this era, too, post offices weren't necessarily federal property, but they were still operated by the federal government. So even though it was privately owned, it still was a U.S. post office. So these businesses expanded and grew in reputation. Again, as I had mentioned, Lehman got the title of the Merchant Prince of Washington County through his successes in Slinger. And his businesses were referred to as the House of Rosenheimer. And the sons, again, continued the businesses. There's a quote coming up that I'm going to read, which is very interesting. It says, "This Schlesingerville is not a very large place, probably about half as large as West Bend, but from appearances, we should judge that the business done there would compare favorably to this village, being West Bend. There are 2 large stores in this place, L. Rosenheimer and Sons and John Pick and Sons." And we do have a Pick family member in the audience. She said hello. You can see her wave there. Yeah, both firms doing a heavy business, judging from the large stock they carry. And this was the West Bend News at the time in 1875. So key point there is, and no different from today, West Bend is the largest community in the county. But at that time, the amount of business that was being done in little Schlesingerville was comparable to what was going on in West Bend. So just, again, because Lehman and his sons got so many of these businesses started, I just thought that was a fantastic recognition of his success. So Lehman's family continued to grow. He had 7 more children while in Schlesingerville, for a total of 11. And I will tell you this, there has not been a Rosenheimer since that's had a family of 11. So he kind of set the bar pretty high there. And again, he lost 2 children in their infancy, but he had 7 sons and 2 daughters. Key here is, if you want to keep the family name going, have a lot of sons. So I only have 1 son, so I'm trying to keep the name going as well. But you can see here's a family picture of his children of the time. And, you know, as you look at all these pictures from the era, people never look happy. But I think, who knows how long they had to pose like that before the picture got taken. You know, maybe it was 20 minutes, who knows. So just a quick synopsis of his children. John, Max, and Joseph stayed in Schlesingerville and became merchants following in their father's businesses. Moritz and Adolf relocated to Kewaskum. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Meyer became a physician in Milwaukee. Barbara lived in Hartford. Elizabeth lived in Cedarburg. And Moses lived in Schlesingerville. So obviously nobody strayed very far from mom and dad. They all stayed in the relative area. So the next part is Kewaskum. And for those of you that don't know where the Kewaskum name came from, Chief Kewaskum was a Potawatomi Indian chief. So they honored him by naming the village after him. And the mascot for the Kewaskum High School is still the Kewaskum Indians. So we keep hoping that they don't lose that mascot, as we've seen many schools lose that, because it's not a slight on Indians at all. It's a recognition of what Chief Kewaskum did. So anyway, just a little Kewaskum trivia there. Here's another interesting factoid. The railroad happened to come to Kewaskum in 1873. In 1874, Moritz relocated to Kewaskum. Think he learned a little bit from his dad? You know, so again, the commerce followed the railroad. And so he established the L. Rosenheimer department store in Kewaskum, which was another version of the Schlesingerville version. So as the success in Kewaskum followed the success in Schlesingerville, 2 years later, his brother Adolf joined him, who was only 15 at the time, so still relatively young. But here's a picture of the original store. So, you know, back early in 1874. So this was a big event, and you're going to laugh when you hear this story. So the L. Rosenhammer department store sponsored Manure Spreader Delivery Day. And that's what this is. And it was a serious event, so everyone who purchased a spreader posed with their team of horses. This was taken in 1912, so, obviously it was a big event. They took a nice picture. Behind, and let me just point this out, this is the store, and you'll see other pictures of it. And the store still exists much in the same condition that it was back in that era. The original store was rebuilt and expanded in 1903. And this was a very important part of my life, too, because I remember this. In 1974, they celebrated 100 consecutive years in business. And even at that time, there weren't many businesses that were around 100 years. So I'm just going to point out, as we go from left to right here, Moritz, who was my great-grandfather, and Adolf, his brother. And then they operated the store from 1874 to 1911. The second generation, David and my grandfather, Lehman. David was a cousin, not a lineal descendant, but a cousin. And don't take this as the Rosenheimer scandal now. 2 Rosenheimers married. Okay? So David married a Rosenheimer, distant relative, no scandal here. So they operated the store from 1911 to 1946. So before I leave my grandfather, I have a quick grandfather story, Grandfather Lehman, which has to do with the West Bend Country Club, where we are right now. So, and I told Peter Ziegler this story before, so he knows what's coming here. So as the country club was being formed, would have been in the 1930s, I think, my grandfather Lehman and Ben Ziegler were 2 of the principal charter members of the club. So they were responsible for getting other charter members in, obviously for financial reasons and other reasons. And the version my father always told me is my grandfather brought in more charter members than Ben Ziegler did. And Ben never finished second to anyone, so they had an agreement between each other. He said, Lehman, here's the deal. I'm going to be the first president of the country club, and you're going to be the second. And that's the way it worked. So before you leave tonight, if you go down the hallway to the right here, when they've got the pictures of all the presidents of the West Bend Country Club, you'll see Bernhard Ziegler was the first, and Lehman was the second. So it worked out. So then the next generation is my father's generation. My father Lehman's on the far right, and his cousin Henry on the left, and they ran the business from 1946 to 1974. So post-World War II, and my father was got caught up in World War II. So when he got out of the service, his father said, I guess time to get in the business, Lem. So my dad got in the business. And this is actually a trivet, which is on a table in the back. And I really encourage all of you, we have a lot of memorabilia that's in a back table where we had the cocktails. So if you have a chance, please look at that. You'll see the trivia. I've got this on my kitchen table. I use it all the time. But a lot of these were given out as a remembrance of the 100th anniversary. And the other thing that I remember, I was a teenager at the time, and this was a big deal. Channel 4, WTMJ, TV in Milwaukee, came up and filmed a segment at the store interviewing my dad and his partner Hank, just recognizing that they were in business for 100 years. That's how important it was in 1974. So anyway, I mean, I remember that to this day, how important that was. So the next slide shows us, it's the store today. You don't see a great deal of difference, The store is, again, very soundly built. So from 1912 to current day, it's an antique mall right now. A client of mine works at the antique mall, and she keeps encouraging me to stop in, and I haven't. I feel bad, but it's still a place that's respected and known well in Kewaskum. So what Moritz and Adolf did in Kewaskum was very similar to what their father and brothers did in Schlesingerville. They duplicated the success by establishing the following businesses: a grain business, a creamery, and for those of you that know Kewaskum history, there was a dairy in Kewaskum, I believe there still is. It was Fairmont for a while, and then it became Kemp's, started again by the Rosenheimers. A malting house, a bank, Bank of Kewaskum, a fire insurance company, warehouses, a farm implement dealership, John Deere products, of course, a grain elevator, the Kewaskum Aluminum Company, which ultimately became Regalware. So again, you can kind of tell two brothers came to Kewaskum, and there wasn't a lot in Kewaskum at the time, and look at their impact, kind of following Dad's success. It's incredible. By the 1890s, Moritz and Adolph owned and operated just about every commercial enterprise in Kewaskum. And again, that's my lineage was Kewaskum. When Linda said, I grew up in Kewaskum, the first 5 years of my life were living in Kewaskum. We had a place on Cedar Lake. So then in the mid-60s, we took a family vote. Do you want to move to the lake year-round or stay in Kewaskum? And the lake won. So, in fact, my sister Heidi and her husband Ross still live in that same home today, which we'll talk about a little later. But anyway, so I spent a lot of my time on the lake. I know the lake very well, and I love the lake. And I love the things the foundation does to preserve that lake. And I know Jeff McClay started much of this, and I was aware at the time when he got this started. But again, I thank you personally for everything that this organization does to preserve the lake. So thank you. Okay, so the next chapter of the story is the Rosenheimer Resort, which a lot of people know a little bit about, but not a lot. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We're getting to Big Cedar now, so we kind of have journeyed from Milwaukee to Schlesingerville to Kewaskum, so now we're coming back to Big Cedar Lake. In 1845, a gentleman by the name of Baruch Schlesinger Weil, Schlesinger middle name, guess where Schlesingerville came from? From Baruch. So he founded Schlesingerville in 1848, and he purchased 2,000 acres of portions of Big Cedar Lake and the current Slinger from the federal government for 25 cents an acre. Again, 25 cents an acre. Who says there's no inflation? So Lehman purchased the current Cedar Lake Yacht Club Point from Mr. Weil in the 1860s. Wheel. In the 1860s. So he built a stone-bonded warehouse for the Rinskopf's distillery. And a lot of you, if you know the yacht club, you can kind of even picture some of that stonework. The property...
I believe they uncovered some maybe this summer. Does anybody... They started knocking up a portion of a wall and they found a...
I wouldn't doubt that those walls were probably never destroyed, maybe just covered over, right? So the property was sold back to the Wheel family, Wheel in 1870. The Wheel family formed the Cedar Lake Park Resort Corporation. They built the largest hotel on what is now Cedar Lake Yacht Club property. This is kind of an odd angle, but here is the yacht club and the present-day yacht club. The bay to the north was referred to as Rosenheimer Bay. I never knew that we had even a bay named after us. Son John, built rental cottages, a dozen rental cottages in this area just to the north off the bay. And then the resort and the beach extended to the south. So if you look carefully on the lake, from the yacht club, kind of from where the boat ramp is to the south, you can still see sand. And that was sand from that original beach that was created. So I'm showing you this just to give you some proximity as I talk about the resort coming up here. So the largest hotel on the lake was built, which is the Cedar Lake Park Hotel, on what is now the Cedar Lake Yacht Club property. Again, this wasn't the only hotel. It was one of few. So this was a picture of the Park Hotel. And if you know, there's a little street just south of the yacht club, which is called Cedar Park Lane. So they kind of kept that name in that little street. The hotel had 60 rooms, capacity for 250 people. They had a saloon, an ice cream parlor, a circular dance hall, and a bowling alley. I mean, even by today's standards, that's a pretty nice place. And a good sized place, too, for, looking back in that era as well. Another interesting thing that came about is the Sioux line rail that ran from Milwaukee to Fond du Lac. They constructed a railroad station, the Cedar Lake Station, in 1909. So it was just west of the lake, and if any of you can picture Arthur Road, there's a bridge there. That bridge in the back of the train was Arthur Road, just to give you an idea of where that station was. So what the beauty of this station was, passengers could take the train from Milwaukee up to the Cedar Lake Station, get off, and then be taken by a horse-drawn taxi for a whopping 25 cents per passenger for a ride to the Cedar Park Hotel. The station was abandoned in 1921 and actually burned in 1926. So I'm thinking, okay, well, what happened during that time? The automobile came along. So I'm sure the trail or the train was convenient until all of a sudden roads came into play and automobiles came into play. But anyway, it was nice, and this was actually a flyer showing the train service to the Cedar Lake Station, $1.35 round trip from Milwaukee. So pretty reasonable at that time. So again, and I'm sure passengers didn't go just to the Cedar Hotel, Cedar Resort Hotel. I'm sure there were probably other places that they may have also visited on the lake. So Lehman's son purchased the Cedar Park Resort in 1895. So that's how the resort appeared. Well, and this picture was in 1912, but very similar to that. It became one of the most popular resorts in the state of Wisconsin. So as I mentioned, John also built the 12 rental cottages on Rosenhammer Bay, again, just north. And John loved to see people being happy. And he did everything he could to make all of his guests at the resort happy and felt welcome. So obviously, if this is circa 1920, it almost looks like a traffic jam, doesn't it? There's a lot of cars in a small space there. If you look in the far distance, that point is probably the top of Fox Hill, just to give you some proximity. So, but anyway, another interesting John story is he was a stickler about lights out at midnight, except if it was a weekend, it was 1 a.m. But what he would do is he would drive his vehicle around and he would honk his horn if you had a light on. And if you heard that honk, the lights had to go out. So obviously no all-night parties at the Rosenheimer Resort there. Also, we have a picture coming up of a water slide at Rosenhammer Resort. So doesn't that look like fun? I mean, you don't see any water slides today anymore. And there was another slide at Godwin Resort in the north end of the lake, too, at that time. So next slide is Rosenhammer Shoreline. Again, just picture the point where the Cedar Lake Yacht Club is now and then coming south from there. So that is the beach area of the shoreline. And another view of that beach. And then there was the swimming beach there. So obviously people out having fun in the summer back in that era. There also was a pleasure boat which took lake tours. It's called Witch of the Waves. Doesn't sound like a real smooth ride on that boat. I don't know why. The tour cost, again, 25 cents. 25 cents was like a magic number, I think, back in that time. And occasionally mail was delivered as well on the lake through the Witch of the Waves boat. Sailboat races typically began at or near the Rosenhammer Resort. Where's the next slide? That's right. So obviously, boats of that era, I mean, not much wind that day, so I don't know that there was much of a race. And then here was one of the next major improvements to the resort. John Rosenheimer, again, Lehman's son, constructed a new octagonal-shaped dance hall. And This was on the resort property in 1920. It was the largest dance hall in Wisconsin at the time. This is incredible stuff, to think in our backyard, these were the biggest places in Wisconsin. And think about your history. What were the 1920s? The Roaring 20s. So they were right at the start of the Roaring 20s. So the grand opening was on June 27th of 1920. And Pat Neitzel Orchestra from Watertown was the entertainment. And they had almost 1,500 dancers. That's a lot of dancers. So the dance hall was packed every weekend. So obviously it had a great following. Famous big bands and entertainers came. Obviously you're going to know these names: Guy Lombardo, Jimmy Dorsey, Art Cassell, Lawrence Welk, and Louis Armstrong. Here in our backyard. Crazy. If that happened today, they would go crazy to have big entertainers. So yeah, it was a big deal in that era. And when you talk to people, there aren't many people that are still around from that era, but I do remember in my youth hearing some of these people, and it was a big deal. In fact, early in my working career, I talked with a guy from the St. Louis area, and he was a little older than I was at the time, and we got talking about West Bend, and he said, "Oh, we used to come up to Timbers Resort all the time." From St. Louis, Timbers had a reputation. So, Big Cedar Lake was a destination in that era. So just incredible to think of what we know today of the lake and what it was back at that time. Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. So along with the good, there's some bad. And John passed away in 1923, and he left the resort operation to his two sons, John Jr. and Meyer. And in 1931, this is what a lot of people know from history: the hotel burned. And a lot of people just know that, and it was sad. To think about the big bands and everything else going on, and then unfortunately there was a fire that destroyed the hotel. So it's at the dance hall and the grocery area were partially destroyed. But think about fighting a fire in that era. Even today, if you have a fire in the town of West Bend, it takes a little while for help to come from West Bend or Slinger. So fires are not a good thing, even though you're on the water here. So in 1936, John sold his resort holdings to Meyer, who then remodeled the tavern and dance hall. In 1944, Meyer sold the resort to Ed and Vivian Stark. In 1949, Cottages sold to the Laycock family. A lot of people know the Laycock Resort, named for a long time. And currently it's operated as the Big Cedar Lake Resort. In the 1950s, the resort was sold to Marty Zifko. In 1957, the resort property on the point was sold to the Cedar Lake Yacht Club. And in 1965, the remainder of the Rosenheimer Shoreline was sold to the Cedar Lake Yacht Club. Okay, let's put things in perspective here. Why did we go from such happy, great times to kind of depressing all these sales? Well, two major things happened in that time. The Depression in the 30s, World War II. Changed things dramatically. So like you went from the exuberance of the 20s, the roaring 20s, all the big dance groups, to all of a sudden things started to wind down in the 30s, and then in the 40s the war came along. So from kind of the rise to the fall of that great era on the lake. So I think if you think about it in terms like that, you understand quite a bit. So as we stay on the lake with the story, Mauky Village is the next part of it. You're going to say, what is Mauky Village? Right? You don't know. So little Big Cedar Lake history. The lake was originally called Miskowak. Now, I'm not good at Indian pronunciations. I hope I did okay there. And then it was Red Cedar, and finally Big Cedar. So if you look on the center pieces of all your tables, you see a little slab of cedar. All the trees on Big Cedar Lake, which we call cedar trees, are red cedars. So that's where the Red Cedar Lake came from. Now, obviously, Little Cedar has a lot of cedar trees too. So you wanted to separate Big Cedar from Little Cedar. So I'm sure that's how those names came about, which was an Algonquin term, Miskawak, and we believe it meant red cedar. And ultimately, it got to the name of Big Cedar. So in 1894, oh, I'm sorry, it had to do with, I meant to say this, turtles, red cedars, or being near a stream. So this, if you don't recognize this portion of the lake, this is the east shore of the channel of the lake. So this is the area that was Milwaukee Nook, which is now known as the German Village. So in, again, that near a stream. So this is the Olsen family cottage, which my great-grandfather Moritz built in 1897, still exists today. Very, Ralph, probably very close to what it was from the day one, too, I would guess. Again, the Olsen family currently still use the cottage. There were 7 Rosenheimer families that owned properties in this area of the lake. So what John and Moritz and Adolph had purchased in 1894 were deeds to 26 50-acre lots in this area of the German Village. The other interesting thing is the depth of these lots was 1,000 feet from the shoreline. And there aren't many 1,000-foot depths of properties on Big Cedar. And that's still the same dimensions today. So the back of these lots go to the Cedar campus property, to give you an idea of what's behind all these lots. So there are 2 Rosenheimer families still living in the German Village. So it was known as the German Village throughout history, except during World War I. And then it was called Liberty Village. They dropped the German name. But as you hear the German Village, and mainly as a respect to the Rosenheimer heritage being German immigrants. So again, the 2 families are my sister Heidi and her husband Ross, and the Olsen family, who we have representation of both here with us tonight. Next, we go to the Rosenheimer Cemetery. And this is, again, one of the most special places to all the descendants. So as Lehman passed away after a short illness on September 21 of 1878 at the age of 58. By today's standards, 58 sounds awfully young, but in that time, 58 was a pretty full life when you think about it. You didn't have modern medicine and things, so and the monument that you see pictured here was the monument his sons purchased to honor their father. And that monument still stands today. It's the largest monument in the cemetery grounds. So I'm just going to read this to you. This was the obituary from the Washington County Republican. Lehman Rosenheimer is no more. The merchant prince, so well known, honored and respected, has passed away from all that is of this world. We doubt if there is one or has been one so extensively known by citizens of this and adjoining counties as was L. Rosenheimer. His large business included all classes of merchandise. In fact, for a number of years, he controlled the grain market, sometimes demanding whole train cars to ship his purchases to Milwaukee. So, pretty respected of everything that he did in his 58 years. Well, think about it, in his 38 years of life in this country, coming here, at the age of 40. Or at the age of 20, but from 20 to 1978, or from 40 to 78. So here's the other important part of the cemetery, and what we're so proud of is one of Lehman's dying wishes was the family would gather on the anniversary of his death every year. The thought behind that was you keep the family together by asking everyone to gather. And we've done it for 143 consecutive years. So that's pretty impressive. And I will admit a few minor changes to his original honor, and that is over the years, we've selected the Saturday or Sunday closest because it's hard to get a lot of people together during the work week. So it was on Sundays for a long time. And all of a sudden, I started, was the president at the time, there was always a conflict with the Packer game. So we decided, I kind of came up with the decision, the board went along with me, let's move it to Saturdays versus Sunday. Well, then you got Badger game conflicts. So I think this was the first year we didn't have a Badger game. I think it was the bye week, and we avoided the Packers. So, but that's just, if the weekend day falls on the 21st, we always honor that day. So if it happens to be Sunday, the 21st, we would have the meeting on that day. But again, it's a special place for all of us. My wife is buried there, my parents, my grandparents, my aunts, my uncles, and all the rest of the relatives. I know where they are. They're all in this special place. And when we start each meeting, each year, we recite the Lord's Prayer, and then we take a moment of silence to remember all those that have passed away and are there with us. And I think we all feel that presence, that my great-great-grandfather's there, and at least he's still watching over me. He hasn't fallen off the mantle or anything. But it is a special place for all of us, and I'm proud to be the president of the association. My father told me at one point in my life, he said, this is going to be you someday, because he did it for a number of years. And just, I want to clear one thing up. My name, Lay, L-A-Y, is not part of Lehman. My name came from my grandmother. Her maiden name was Lay. And Lay was another Kewaskum family. They operated a lumber yard, the Lay Lumber Company. So my father's name was Lehman Lay Rosenheimer. So many people think Lay is a derivative of Lehman, but it's not. My family has continued the Lehman name. My brother's name is Robert Lehman. My son is Matthew Lehman. So that name is so important that we've continued it. And I can't guarantee my son's going to do it, but I hope he does. But, and I don't force the history on him, but he's interested. And he picks up a little bit. I wish he would have been here tonight. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it. But he did have to endure the practice sessions, so he did hear this. And the other thing that I want to recognize, if you don't mind, we have 3 generations of Rosenheimers with us this evening. And I want to recognize I'm the 5th, and I've got some other 5th generations. Let's just look at the 5th generations first. If you could just stand up or wave. Okay. And sixth generation. Chuck. Cecily. And most importantly, 7th generation. So Cora, my great niece, I just have to pass this along. She calls the monument the guy with the big grave. So your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather is the guy with the big grave. So we're going to conclude this with just some pictures of Cedar Lake, just to bring things in perspective. This is Maclay's Bay. You can see the Heineman's Point. This is, again, looking to the west. And then Sheminar's Bay. I don't know if that name has carried through the years too much. Sheminar's Bay is just to the north of the channel on the west shore. That bay is Sheminar's Bay. And we used to do a lot of water skiing in that bay, only because it was calm. But the bad thing was you never wanted to fall because it was mucky and weedy, and you wanted to get out of there as fast as you could. But that's Sheminar's Bay. One of the ways they created the sandy shore around the Rosenhammer Resort is you actually dumped sand on the ice. Now, obviously, the DNR doesn't want to know that anymore. I've known some people that have done it in recent years, but not exactly kosher with the DNR right now. But that's how you created a sandy beach at the time. And this is a view of the islands in the northern part of the lake, looking from the west shore toward the east. Highland Park Road. So this would be on the southwest part of the lake, kind of looking to the east. Isn't it amazing when you look at it and you don't see homes? You see what it looked like back in that era. And as Linda spoke earlier, the Cedar Creek Dam. And here's just a little interesting trivia, which many of you probably know. So Big Cedar is spring fed, and it has an outflow, the dam. This is one of the reasons Cedar is so clean, is you've got spring fed, and you have an outflow. So the waters from Big Cedar flow all the way into Lake Michigan. And isn't that incredible? And do you know how that's possible? I actually looked this up. The level of Big Cedar Lake, despite the 6 inches that Linda talked about, that's down, is about 1,032 feet above sea level. And I just looked this up. The elevation of Lake Michigan is 577 feet. That's a 455-foot drop. So how does water flow that far with an elevation difference like that? So again, trivia. If you pick up anything tonight, you go, hey, this guy talked about the elevation of Lake Michigan. So 577 feet. So, and this is Highway 144 looking north toward Rosenheimer Resort. You can again see the point there and the sailboats. Again, the road isn't much different from what we know it to be today. So the most important part is to recognize, you say, man, you've got a lot of history, recorded history. That's good and that's bad. The good thing is we can tell a nice story. The bad thing is it was hard to pull it all together. And the only way it happened was from the help of many people. We have 2 representatives from the Slinger Historical Museum with us tonight. Would you raise your hand or stand? Great, thank you. Again, we talked about Schlesingerville and Slinger, so it's a great museum. You celebrated your first anniversary, correct? So I'm sure if any of you are interested in learning more about Slinger history, you can talk to these gentlemen or visit the Historical Museum. There have been a couple of recent publications. Kewaskum, The Making of a Village, that came out a year ago. And also Slinger, the Advancement Association, came out with a book. Again, good sources of information. In fact, both those books are on that back table that I mentioned if you want to look at them. Lee and Mary Krieger put together The Town of West Bend, which included quite a bit of history on the lake area. Many of you know Barbara Johnson wrote this Big Cedar Lake, A Guide to Her Past and Present. And the Rosenheimer and Olsen families were great resources for me, and specifically my sister Heidi and her husband Ross. They pulled a lot of this together. Ross did a great job in putting the whole PowerPoint together for me. I'm just the front man here. I'm just a singer in the band, I got to give credit to the band, and everyone else is the band. And I hope you found this interesting. You can tell I have a passion talking about it, and I'm glad we were able to get this on video as well, so we have a record of this. And again, I can't thank you enough for your attention and interest. And again, everything that the association does. And I'm not going to hold up dinner any longer. I've had my piece here. So thank you all for your attention.